podcast listeners, welcome to the NK News podcast. I am your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and today it is Thursday, April 13th, 2023. I'm joined in the NK News studio by Joanna Hosaniak of the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights to talk about where we stand 10 years after the Committee of Inquiry. But first, a request and a reminder to leave a review about this podcast or whatever platform you use and share this episode with everyone you think should hear it or who might be interested. And what's more, like and subscribe to the whole series. Second, check out nknews.org, where each day my journalist colleagues put out the best North Korea-focused journalism, and a subscription for a year costs less than $1 a day, which helps to fund their work and also this podcast. Thirdly, you can follow nknews.org on Twitter and me at JackoZ. Now, to introduce my guest today more fully, Joanna Hosaniak is the Deputy Director General of Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights. She's been a staff member there since 2004. Before that, she worked at the South Korean Embassy in Poland and the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. You can find the Citizens Alliance online at nkhr.or.kr and on Facebook by searching for Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights and on Twitter at NK Human Rights. Welcome on the show, Joanna.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
Hello, it's great to have you on the show. Your organization, the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, is the world's oldest NGO devoted exclusively to North Korean human rights, founded way back in 1996 here in Seoul. Tell us a little bit about the history of the organization and how it came to be and what it does and how that's changed over time.
Yes, the history of the oldest organizations here in South Korea is very interesting because many of these organizations have been established by a generation of South Korean pro-democracy, pro-human rights activists. And these were activists in the 60s, in the 70s, 80s. They fought for democracy here under the military rule. And this is the history of Citizens Alliance as well. Our chairman and founder was one of the persons who also established Amnesty chapter in South Korea under military rule here, fought for prisoners of conscience, supported families, supported, broadcasts internationally during the trials of some of the prisoners and supported them in prisons. And then when South Korea democratized, many of this pro-democracy movement activists realized that there needs to be, they need to establish organization related to North Korea because the first North Korean refugees started coming in on the wave of hunger in North Korea. And this is the history of the Citizens Alliance.
Right, and you mentioned your founder, so tell us a little bit about Benjamin Hyun-yoon, the late founder of Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, who passed away 2019, I believe. Tell us about who he was and how he became the father of North Korean human rights movements.
He was a person who was actually born in Japan to Korean parents, and in his youth, he was influenced by communist ideology. He did go to the north. And
before the war?
Before the war. And during the war, he realized completely how the communist system works. He saw many things that he didn't agree with. At the same time, he started to study theology. Later, he became a pastor. But during military rules here and during problems here, he became involved in pro-democracy movement here. At the same time, when in the 80s, when he established a South Korean Amnesty chapter, he received one of the first reports of the Amnesty, at that time headquarters of Amnesty, in relation to what is happening in North Korea. And these first reports were written by some pro-communist activists and military personnel who went to North Korea to support Kim Il-sung, to work on translations and so on, from Latin America, from France and other countries.
Right, there was the famous Venezuelan poet, Ali Lameda.
Yes. And so when he read the story of Ali Lameda and others, and how they were put to prison, and he decided that his later path will actually include human rights in North Korea. But it was very difficult to find support in the South Korean society and among the democracy activists to actually include North Korean human rights.
Right. That was in the 1980s, wasn't it?
Yes.
Because there were a lot of students in the student movement in the 1980s were very pro-Juche, pro-Kim Il-sung. That's when the Jusapa arose at that time. So, yeah, I can imagine it would have been difficult at that time to get support for North Korean human rights activism.
It wasn't even difficult. It was overtly hostile environment.
Yeah.
So he had a lot of trouble, and this is why he decided to establish separate organization.
Right. Now, you've been working there at the Citizens Alliance since 2004. That's almost 20 years. How did you come to work there? And also, apart from you, is everybody else in the organization Korean?
Everyone is Korean. I am the only foreigner. And we sometimes do have foreigners, but they are interns, of course. And how I became involved. When I was born in Poland was still a communist country. So when Poland democratized, we had to choose where we would go to study. And most of my class went to study law and business because that was the needs after transition.
Sure.
I decided to do something more original, and I was drawn into Japanese and Korean studies. And I ended up to study Korean at the Korean department in Warsaw. But at the time when I entered Korean department, we were the first year that was taught by South Korean professors. Before, all of my friends were, let's say, taught by North Korean professors, and some of our Polish professors also studied at the Kim Il-sung University. But we never discussed the situation in North Korea. So we kind of discussed southern part of the peninsula and rarely anything related to North Korea. And this was where I started searching online in the first internet, and I came across Citizens Alliance and the first testimonies that they published, because it was mid-90s and late 90s. And I decided at that time that somehow I will get involved. It took a while, but for several years after, when working at the South Korean embassy, I was also taking a weekend course for human rights activists from Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. And when Citizens Alliance contacted them, I was chosen to be coordinator for a conference that they were preparing in Europe at that time, Conference on North Korean Human Rights and Refugees. And they ended up inviting me to Seoul in 2004.
Now, more recently, it's been revealed that some North Korean workers have been working at the shipyards in Poland, in Gdansk. Was that happening at that time when you were studying there? Did you already meet some North Koreans or see some North Koreans working in Poland?
Yes, I haven't met North Koreans because at that time, you know, these workers that were working in shipyard, they were completely secluded and nobody had really access to them except North Koreans. Of course, the Polish workers at the shipyard knew that they were working, but even them could not interact with these workers. But it was the result of the conference that a journalist that we knew started to search for connections between Poland, especially that, you know, in Poland at that time still Socialist Party, which was kind of remains of the previous regime, operated, and many journalists suspected that there are a lot of business types of relations. And this is how this story came out first from the Polish journalists based as a result of the conference.
Now, as you know, talking about North Korea in general and North Korean human rights in particular in the context of South Korea and in the Korean language, these are politically charged acts, as we already mentioned before, especially in the 1980s when the situation was quite hostile. These days, I'm wondering, where does the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights fit into the South Korean political spectrum?
We are a non-political organization, and so I think there is a big misunderstanding in South Korean society and sometimes among certain scholars, especially Western scholars, that somehow each organization that works here has to be related to a certain political party or affiliated and so on. As I mentioned, our founders were really pro-democratization, pro-human rights activists, and their motto was promoting universal human rights in North Korea, and especially the ones that North Korea voluntarily acceded to or was obliged to kind of, you know, implement through their voluntary accession to the UN human rights treaties. This is the same methodology that they used in the past vis-a-vis South Korea. And so we as Citizens Alliance do not associate ourselves with any religion, any party. It is unfortunate that, South Korea is so politically divided that North Korean human rights are usually only mentioned by the so-called pro-conservative and conservative party and pro-conservative kind of wings or in the society, and that progressives everywhere in the world, when we say that someone is progressive, is actually someone who includes human rights and is tolerant, right? Does not discriminate, but this doesn't happen here. This is an unfortunate situation, but that doesn't mean that many organizations are somehow affiliated with any of these governments. We tried to stay in the middle, focusing mostly on internationalization of the issue. We're the first human rights organization that brought this issue to the awareness of the international community because, as you know, North Korea, despite the fact that they were member state of the UN for such a long time, they were flying under the radar of the UN for international community for such a long time, without any scrutiny, without impunity. And we simply thought that we have to publish the reports based on the first testimonies and first documents that we had access to, engage UN more and UN treaties and UN bodies to actually start scrutinize North Korea, the same as they scrutinize any other country.
Yeah, now, coming back to the left-right political divide in South Korea, it does seem, as you say, that in the 1980s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the progressives in South Korea were very focused on human rights and political liberalization here in South Korea. And then after that happened, not everybody, but it does seem that the mainstream of the progressives in South Korea sort of turned away from applying the same principles, the same standards to human rights in North Korea. And I wondered, are you aware of, was there a debate or a conflict within the left in South Korea that some said, well, we should really remain in favor of North Korean human rights, and the others said, well, it's a special case, we have to leave them alone?
As you mentioned, Jacob, before, some of the people that were in this progressive or pro-democracy movement were heavily influenced by North Korea itself and by North Korean ideology. And so the conflict was severe because this was ideological conflict. Many of them thought that the reason why some of these people split and want to raise North Korean human rights is actually the propaganda of the South Korean authoritarian rules, how they kind of use this information to differentiate themselves vis-a-vis North Korea and to justify their rules, right? And so they disbelieved many of these testimonies, they questioned them, and so this severe conflict caused the split between many activists that went to establish North Korean human rights organizations or any news promoting organizations or getting news out of North Korea later on, and the rest that remained in the so-called progressive part of the political spectrum, but also progressive organizations, because as you probably are aware, many so-called progressive organizations here in South Korea do not include North Korean human rights issue. Even Amnesty chapter in South Korea for a very long time did not cover North Korean human rights issue. Later on, it was done, all the reporting and all the investigations were done from London.
Now, I'm not entirely sure of the history of Amnesty International, but I have a feeling, to me it seemed in the early 2000s that Amnesty worldwide wasn't focusing very much on North Korean human rights, not just here in South Korea.
Yes, that's true. But the first reports that came out, very limited reports, actually came out from Human Rights Watch, or before that it was kind of, Minnesota lawyers and this type of organizations that later went under umbrella of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. That was the only type of reports, even no matter how brief, related to human rights situation in North Korea.
Does Citizens Alliance call for a regime change in North Korea?
No, of course not. We do believe that people have to choose their path, And so this is up to people in North Korea how they will decide their future. However, in deciding their future, they also have to be aware of the violations that are happening to them, to kind of give them a name, And so we also promote, let's say, we would like the North Korean government to embark on a path of some form of reforms where human rights situation will start to be protected. And so we view our work as kind of putting pressure on North Korean government, international pressure, to actually start changes inside the country. How they do the changes is up to them. However, it is obvious for everyone that the situation cannot continue in this way. The whole state is based on the system of slavery, kind of feudalistic type of economy, and that is using human chattels, to produce welfare for only the privileged and the elites. This has to change. This is outmoded version of operations, and North Korea being a part of a system where they voluntarily acceded and recognize universal principles, they need to start to implement these universal principles on the ground.
What's the relationship of the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights to the South Korean government, in particular the Unification Ministry? Is there liaising going on?
As I explained to you, the liaising is always on and off depending which organization is, which government and which government administration is in power. Whenever there are progressive governments, pro-engagement governments in power, there is limited contact, or during Moon Jae-in administration, there were attempts to close down some of these organizations, as you know, especially organizations that were broadcasting or sending information to North Korea. But we also, as Citizens Alliance, were included in this type of investigations that ministry was doing, and they were threatening that they would not renew our license. Unfortunately, in South Korea, the situation is that all of the organizations, NGOs, unlike anywhere in the modern world, democratic countries, they have to be registered under the ministry which is related to the area of operation. So if you work on North Korean human rights, you have to be registered under Ministry of Unification in order to also, for example, issue tax benefits to donors, to private donors. And this was, the threat. They asked us to reveal the whole base of the individual donors, of our beneficiaries, and so on. And we declined. And we also submitted the general allegations against South Korean government, Moon Jae-in government, to UN, to several UN bodies. And the UN took action and was discussing this with the South Korean administration at that time, and recommended changing of this law. The fact that the organizations have to be registered provides opportunity for many administrations to actually manipulate these organizations or somehow threaten them. And they should be independent, as they are independent anywhere else in Western Europe, in United States, and so on. So in terms of, for example, monetary support, we declined all the financial report from any of the ministries and have been receiving the support from individual donors and from abroad, from foreign grants.
Have relations with the government improved since President Yoon took office last year?
Well, President Yoon does speak about North Korean human rights, and so we do have more contacts. However, the context doesn't mean, of course, that we are somehow related to the government. We always try to criticize the government, and our vision is that if the government that is including human rights is in power, and there is a way to improve certain, let's say, policies in terms of awareness of North Korean human rights situation, or how South Korea is resettling North Koreans here because there are many problems in the system itself, then we view it as an opportunity to kind of criticize or work with the government to change that system. But we view ourselves as an NGO, and NGO is a watchdog, meaning that no matter which organization, no matter which administration is in power, we are supposed to criticize the government if there are issues that come up and are, not included by the administration.
Now, from its early days, the Citizens Alliance held annual conferences internationally in a range of cities around the world, and the last of these, I think, was held in March 2013, 10 years ago. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. It was in Berlin, and it was the last conference that we did because at that time already the UN Commission of Inquiry that we lobbied for, advocated for, was established, and we realized that our mission has ended in a way.
10 years later, is it time for another
conference?
Another international conference, yes. I mean, the work is still going on.
I think that after Commission of Inquiry, there is such an awareness about the situation inside North Korea and of North Korean refugees that I don't think that these conferences add much. They probably only keep the flame and awareness among international community, but in a way they cannot add anything new. Like in the past when, the media were not talking about the issue, where many governments did not realize how severe situation is. This is complete change in the international kind of understanding of the North Korean human rights issue. So I think it's not whether we do conference or not, it would have different purpose, I would say, at this point. I think at this point, more than the conferences, we have to focus on how to advance the COI recommendations 10 years after, because none of them were advanced.
Yes, and we'll definitely talk about the COI a bit more later on. First of all, a couple of critical views here. Before COVID, it used to be that many North Koreans went across the border into China, doing some trading, looking for food, etc. Of the large number of North Koreans who went to China, most of them never came to South Korea, as far as we know, and most people in North Korea never tried to leave it, and this leaves some critics to suggest that maybe it means North Koreans are happy in North Korea, or at least happy enough that they don't try to leave. And if they do leave, they don't try to come to South Korea. And I wonder what you think of that reading, and are there alternative possible readings?
It is very difficult for us to know what the situation in North Korea is like right now. And there are very conflicting reports coming out depending whom you talk to. And so people who were reliant on market economy, especially Changmadang system, because it has faltered to a certain extent, I think they do have certain trouble with accessing, not only with trade, but also a lot of private citizens have problem with accessing some of the necessities. However, that situation also depends on whom you talk to and in which region, because there were still regions where this type of private economy operated. And I talked to some of my students who actually showed me the recording with for example, family members inside North Korea during COVID, asking whether they received, for example, money and whether they are able to buy food and so on. And they were able. They were saying that the food is limited, but if you have money, you are still able to find some of this, necessities.
When you say money, I mean, are we talking local North Korean money, or does it have to be hard currency?
Hard currency, always
so
hard
dollars
currency.
Or renminbi
dollars
or
yen, yes, Chinese. And so, but the problem is that, North Korea for such a long time has been reliant on this private economy because it does not provide the necessities to majority of the population, only to the elites, right? And so, which means that majority of population was reliant on some form of private activities, trade, this unofficial trade across the border with China. With that being closed, we are aware that the situation must be deteriorating unless the regime has enormous resources and was receiving enormous resources from elsewhere during that time, let's say South Korea and China and Russia, in order to still support the society. However, I think the full picture that we will have will be only after opening the borders. And I think this borders opening will have to happen because I don't think you can keep population like sardines in the can for a very long time, especially when your economy is so dysfunctional, and especially when North Korean economy really relies on the extortion from the society. They have to contribute a lot of goods which are being turned to export. All types of mushrooms, aronia, minerals and so on. All this production is going for so-called foreign currency earning, which is then, let's say, the elites benefit from that and the military benefits from that. So without it, they are unable, the population will be unable to probably provide that for the North Korean government. And that also means that the border will have to be open at some point. But in relation to your question, why many of them did not escape, because China was implementing this zero COVID policy, most of the network helping North Koreans in China has broken down. And so many organizations were unable to help North Koreans. So we knew that some North Koreans stayed in China. It was impossible to move to South Korea. So what we have heard is that majority of North Koreans that came during COVID were actually the foreign workers, for example, the ones from Russia.
Now, I've met people in South Korea who are on the progressive left who argue that North Korean defectors' accounts of hardships and abuse in North Korea cannot be believed because there's too much incentive to lie or to exaggerate their claims. And how do you respond to that?
Well, I would say that so then why do we believe testimonies of South Korean progressive groups and what has happened here during military rule? I mean, this is mostly based on testimonies of people and their families, right? It's the same kind of story. Why do we believe people in Syria, in Bangladesh, in Congo, in Myanmar? Not everything can be recorded. Majority of, if you look at the kind of justice system that was established, let's say post-Rwanda, post-Yugoslavia, the courts themselves, the ad hoc tribunals, the bloodline of the tribunals were testimonies of people, not any kind of exhumations, not any type of even photographic evidence, because there was almost none. This is always based on testimonies of people, and this is where you have to cross-check the information. And so many organizations receiving these testimonies, they are aware that first and foremost, people's memory falter. When time passes by, they might, include things that they think they saw, right? They might confuse certain dates or certain facts, because if you have, for example, let's say 20 years have passed, that is natural. That is what is happening to every human being. However, I would tell you that this is also studies that are confirmed by many doctors and psychologists. If you have very traumatic testimony, you will remember that, even to the point that you remember the date. And when I talk to many North Koreans, when they talk about traumatic experiences, they even remember the time of the day and the date when it happened. That is where our brains store this kind of traumatic versions. And yes, when they are exposed to a lot of torture, this is when the facts may become blurry. Because, in a way, human brain tries to dissociate themselves from pain and from, what they are experiencing. And these testimonies may not be full. That's natural. That happened also to Holocaust victims, and Holocaust victims were also questioned very often. But that's what happens when you have these traumatic testimonies. Our role as NGO is to cross-check as many of these testimonies as possible. And then at some point, you see the trends. You see that person in town A, in village B, in region, North Hamgyong and South Hamgyong, they are telling you similar stories. This is where you are looking for patterns, and patterns are it's what we use in crimes against humanity in our approach, looking for patterns of crimes and then establishing what was the intent, what was the knowledge of these people who were committing this type of patterns of crimes. And whenever there are problematic testimonies, we put them aside. For example, I will tell you one example. I had some testimonies related to North Korea is developing biological and chemical weapons. But these weapons, we know that from history, also from other military, have to be tested on human kind of experimentation, right? And so there were testimonies from North Korea talking about special hospitals that are testing this type of biological chemical weapons on people with disabilities. I cannot confirm this because many of these people have died probably, if it's true. And also people who are involved in this type of experiments, if it's true, they are also did not come out or might never come out. So we put this type of testimonies aside and record them so that if in the future something comes up, then maybe we will be able to cross-check them.
In 2018, Cambridge University Press published a book called North Korean Human Rights, Activists and Networks, in which you wrote a chapter entitled NGOs as Discursive Catalysts at the United Nations and Beyond, an Activist Perspective. And in that chapter, you write that the DPRK had acceded to some of the human rights treaties, the UN human rights treaties, even before it became a full member of the UN, namely the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1981. What does this mean? Does it mean that North Korea recognizes that its citizens have civil and political rights as well as economic, social and cultural rights? I'm interested, how does the North Korean government itself interpret this? And why did it join? Or why did it accede to those covenants?
At the time when North Korea was joining these treaties, and mind you, they joined earlier than South Korea even, right?
That's interesting.
They were looking for ways to justify their regime. And so they wanted to be recognized at the UN level as the only kind of Korean government.
Right, the true Korea.
The true Korean government that is entitled to the whole Korean peninsula.
Right.
And there was a lot of friction between ROK government and DPRK government and supporting, let's say, governments that were supporting both of the governments, which government should represent Korea as a state. And so North Korea did accede to these treaties earlier on to show that they are kind of, legitimate power and that they are the ones that will be implementing all these human rights changes. The reason why they acceded to these treaties was that, North Korea does not have civil society. And so they knew that no type of scrutiny will come from civil society, as it does always with any country around the world. And they probably have seen that. Even, the most kind of totalitarian or authoritarian countries, you still have groups of either people who are outside of the state that are active or inside that were traveling to the UN to actually inform international community of what is really happening on the ground.
Right.
North Korea does not have it. ROK at that time had a lot of problems because they had very active civil society. So the reason why they were not acceding to these treaties was that they were very well aware that immediately the pro-human rights organizations here would challenge them at the international community level.
Right.
And so, that was the kind of motivation for North Korea to accede to all these treaties originally. Then both ROK and DPRK were admitted to the UN in 1991 at the same time, on the same date. That was the agreement.
Right. Because first, I think for decades, each of them said, only let us join, don't let the other Korea join.
Exactly.
And then finally they came to some agreement. During that period of rapprochement between North and South Korea, we'll both join on the same day.
Yes.
And that way it's fair to everybody.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And so, South Korea, when it started its process of democratization, it started acceding to many of these treaties. So did North Korea. But I think for North Korea, for a very long time, this was a very safe game. They knew that nobody will really scrutinize them. And the way that the scrutiny worked was that they presented the governmental reports where everything was perfect in the country, and nobody else could challenge that because there was no information, even at the UN level, among the independent experts and so on, to actually get such independent information from. But this then changed when Citizens Alliance was established, and when we started to challenge North Korean government and started to produce first reports based on the testimonies of people who escaped, bringing especially an information about the political prison camp system. That started changing, and then they've realized that they have a problem. And so the first thing that they did after one of the first report that Citizens Alliance did with one of the international organization, this was challenging them actually on civil and political rights and socio-economic rights. They said, we are withdrawing from this covenant. And the UN system said, no, there is no way. Once you entered and once you are member state of the UN, this is kind of tacit approval that you approve and you agree with the universal values as a member state. And so if you acceded to these treaties, there is no way out. So what they did is that they stopped submitting reports on especially, civil and political rights are problematic for them because there are no civil and political rights. In terms of socioeconomic rights also. So the only kind of scrutiny that they did later on was on CEDAW Convention, the convention that is looking into discrimination against women, and Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Covenant on the Rights of the Child. And especially post-COI, for a very long time, they also stalled these reviews. They stopped collaborating with the UN system, and they stopped also issuing reports on women's and child's situation. But post-COI, the only reports that they submitted was immediately they submitted a report on women and on children, and they went through another review in 2017, 2018.
What is the universal periodic review process, and why does North Korea prefer this to submitting reports to the various UN committees on human rights?
Universal periodic review is a type of a new type of scrutiny that Human Rights Council, before we had Human Rights Commission, when the Human Rights Council was established, many states which do have a lot of problems on the ground said that this type of picking of certain governments and certain countries and naming and shaming is not appropriate for the UN as a whole. So let's establish the universal periodic review when all of the peers, meaning all of the member states of the council at that time, and the council rotates, 47 members, will be able to kind of question the state on the situation on the ground. The reviews are very basic, I would say, because they are so short, and they
can't go into a lot of depth.
They cannot go into a lot of depth, and because these are diplomats that question, that provide these questions, they also cannot scrutinize really the situation on the ground. The type of question that experts, independent experts who have knowledge on certain issues may ask during the review of the committees, it's incomparable to what is happening at the Universal Periodic Review. And this is why North Korea prefers that, because it's very basic kind of review. But having said that, they still had a problem with Universal Periodic Review, because in 2009, during the first review, they actually rejected all of their recommendations. And so, one of the reasons why United Nations Commission of Inquiry was established was this pattern of North Korea non-cooperative attitude with the UN system. This was the only country, I don't know if many listeners realize, the only country that does not collaborate with the UN. Even Myanmar and other countries do invited, independent experts, field-finding, fact-finding missions to their country. This is the only country that does not collaborate, even with special rapporteurs, not on their country, on situation like on food and so on. It's been only post-commission of inquiry that they invited, for example, special rapporteur on persons with disabilities and so on. But in general, they remain non-cooperative.
So let's move on to the COI then. So on the 21st of March 2013, which is 10 years and a month ago, the United Nations Human Rights Council, composed of the 47 nations, as you mentioned, established the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK with Resolution 22/13. Briefly, how was it possible to get support for the COI within the UN Human Rights Council, and how important was the timing?
The timing was important because China and Russia was not part of were not member states of the Human Rights Council at the time.
And either one of them could have blocked it if they'd wanted to.
Yes, they could have blocked it. But we still were aware that there were many countries that China and Russia used for the support, and these countries could block it as well. So, let's say Venezuela or Cuba could also ask for a motion on a vote and somehow block it. However, the timing, we have been preparing for Commission of Inquiry for a long time because we have realized as a civil society, I'm saying that both South Korean victims organizations, abductees victims organizations, political prisoners associations, the international organizations as well that started covering North Korean human rights issue. We've realized that the mandate of the special rapporteur does not really highlight the full depth of the situation inside North Korea. This is just a yearly update. And countries like Syria and Sri Lanka at that time and so on receive much more attention because there is so much more information coming out, including visual information, which we don't have from North Korea, right? We don't even have civil society that could really secretly record what is happening. From time to time, yes, we do have these secret footages coming out, but that's all, right? And so this information is very limited. At the same time, North Korea was, it was post first nuclear test. North Korea was kind of expanding its military investments and threatening countries in the region. So both this type of military posture and non-cooperation with the UN system resulted with the international community. And interestingly, the countries that normally supported North Korea being tired to support North Korea. That's what happened. And so, it was still difficult to convince countries that normally have this penholder position, like EU countries and Japan at that time, right? Right now it's only EU member states, but to include the language. But there were several initiatives taken at that time. One was special rapporteur at that time, Marzuki Darusman, issued a report. He highlighted what special rapporteurs have found and what international community should focus on in depth if such inquiry is established. And Citizens Alliance also went to meet with Navi Pillai, at that time High Commissioner for Human Rights, to ask her for support, to actually tell her that this is the UN system, that they were established to actually monitor human rights. Most of the international community focuses only on nuclear or military issues, and they don't link them to the violations on the ground. And this is where she also issued a statement post that meeting that this kind of inquiry is long overdue. And so this resulted in many EU states and other states that are like-minded to support the language and to establish the Commission of Inquiry.
Now, almost a year after the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry on 7th of February 2014, the report of the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was released for general distribution. In your book chapter, you wrote, "The Commission's 2014 report on human rights abuses in North Korea caused a discursive shift on the international level toward accountability. And I'm wondering, 10 years later, what has fundamentally changed and what remains unchanged?
I think that shift toward accountability is visible, and this is where majority of NGOs are focusing their resources on. Preparing for some form of accountability, whether this is a judicial process as we understand accountability, for example, criminal responsibility of people who were involved in the crimes. And I'm not talking only about the top leadership, I'm talking also about the mid-level of violators, let's say commandants in the camp, people who are running companies attached to Ministry of State Security and Ministry of Police Safety and so on, that actually take resources from these detentions and how they export it. All of these people may face a criminal responsibility in the future. And this is where the international community also started to really channel the resources, but also a lot of organizations that we normally did not have access to in the past, such as, for example, legal community that was involved in many trials, international trials or international investigations, wanted to provide their expertise to NGOs in order to improve their methodology of how this evidence can be admissible in future courts.
Be more rigorous.
More rigorous, and also, how to store it, right? How to provide protection for the victims, what type of information you have to provide to perpetrators so that they do not incriminate themselves without having access to legal assistance yet, right? And so on. So these are the types of assistance that is available right now. And I think that expertise really catapulted many NGOs to a kind of very high level, very high standards of like how they gather the evidence right now, including how we are able to cross-check that evidence vis-a-vis satellite imagery and what victims show us on the satellite photos, how we are able to use, let's say, similar approaches that were used in other countries, let's say Bangladesh and other countries, where connection was done between trade and human rights violations, and how, for example, targeted sanctions system is used against individuals and companies involved in these crimes and production of this type of production. So all of this expertise is available to us. So I see that shift expanding. What has not changed is that we were unable to really move this process forward in terms of accountability. As you know, one of the main recommendations was either referral of the DPRK to International Criminal Court or establishing of ad hoc tribunal. And because the geopolitical situation has changed, because China has also a lot of problems that were highlighted at the UN level, let's say situation in Xinjiang, the Hong Kong issue, right? Taiwan tensions right now, this changed the kind of US-China dynamic. Also, China's tacit support for Russia's aggression vis-a-vis Ukraine, this really kind of stalled the UN Security Council. The referral, because North Korea is not party to the Rome Statute, could only happen through the Security Council right now. And so there has to be other ways devised of how to move this process forward, or whether, to establish any other form of accountability mechanism, or the ad hoc tribunal, which was also recommended by Commission of Inquiry. And this is something that has not been moved forward yet, even 10 years after.
I'm curious, does the Citizens Alliance have a rough number of people who are believed to be held in prison camps located throughout North Korea? And are all these believed to be political prisoners, or does it also include non-political crimes, such as people imprisoned for theft and murder, etc.?
The criminal system, or let's say the detention system in North Korea is divided into several levels. You have a pre-holding center kind of holding centers and investigation centers for those who are repatriated from China. You have secret prisons of the MSS and MPS. You have then kind of normal type of prisons, and in normal types of prisons they are called kyohwaso, which means re-education through labor, kind of type of detention, is where you have both persons who might have escaped North Korea and in that sense committed some form of political crime, right? Because escape from North Korea without permission is forbidden. They might be repatriated to and then punished in these prisons. You also have in these prisons a kind of criminals, let's say someone who murdered someone, who raped someone, and so on. Political prison camps are completely separate. You don't have normal criminals there. It's all about political crimes. And however you define these political crimes, it can be anything, of course. And we know that some of these camps did have included 3 generations of the family, right? And that some of these camps had re-education zones when member families, not the main criminals, but member families could be released after some time. Now, post-commission of inquiry, there have been a lot of changes in political prison camp system. And a lot of these camps have been closed or removed and relocated to other areas. This is probably what, the scrutiny has caused, that they started to relocating some of this because the evidence was already available, including on satellite photos.
Right, that's something you can see through the photos, yeah.
Yes, but you also have to understand that political prison camps and all of the detentions, other detentions like short-term detentions, kyohwasos that I mentioned, are the foundations also of the economic system for North Korea. They are based around the areas that can produce either minerals for export or some other forms of production that will be exported by the companies of MSS and MPS or other companies that trade with them. Everything is interrelated in North Korea. And so
you're saying that the prisoners are a source of free labor?
Yes. As it was in Soviet Union, for example, as it is with Uyghurs in China, this is the same type of operations that exist. And so, the camps are also relocated where to areas where there is new minerals have been found, or for example, resources of coal has been depleted, anthracite in some of it, and they are looking for new resources of coal for export. This is where camps are also relocated to, and so we have to understand that this is not only the result of international scrutiny; it's also how North Korea is producing, how the economy is functioning. And so these are the changes to the system. To answer your questions, we don't know. We know that because they were relocated, we haven't been able to secure some of the new testimonies from people who have been relocated to other areas. And so there is information that some of the camps have reduced in size. However, I have to say one thing. We have been observing Camp 18, which is a camp in Pukchang, not far away from Pyongyang. And this is a camp that normally produces a lot of anthracite coal that is going through the train, is connected to Nampo,
right,
and can be exported. This camp was reported to reduce in size. However, when we were conducting our investigation with the prisoners in this camp on how much is being produced, that is not being included even by UN Sanctions Committee, this type of numbers that the camps are producing, we've realized that the camp was expanding its boundaries. And this coincided with the Moon Jae-in's administration meetings with Kim Jong-un and also former President Trump's meetings with Kim Jong-un. There were also reports at that time that North Korean traders were acting in China to try to sell this coal. They were preparing, one of the main conditions in Hanoi was to lift sanctions on coal in their totality. That was what failed. But they were already preparing to actually sell even more. And this is where we saw that the camps were actually expanding. And our experts, we discussed experts who were experts on mineral and coal production, and they said that they are not conducting, let's say, they are not expanding the piles of coal in width, but in height. They were able to cross-check that on satellite photos, and that they are increasing actually in production.
Right.
So that is, this is one warning where we kind of do not look at, we normally look at the humanitarian situation just of the normal population. We don't understand how this type of reapproachment policies and opening the trade may harm people on the ground, how slavery system can be expanded because they are looking at this as an opportunity to earn more money simply with the lift of the sanctions. So this is one warning that I want to kind of say here, and also the fact that at the same time there were reports of increased shortages of electricity in North Korea. That was interesting to us because if you have sanctions operating and so much coal that not only by us but also other think tanks that were observing the same situation of increased coal production elsewhere as well, you should have more supply domestically, right? And yet it wasn't happening. The schools, the hospitals still were unable to get coal, and there was shortages of electricity even in Pyongyang. That tells us a lot how the system is functioning, and this is what international community should look into, especially when looking into political prison camp system, as this is part of the economy of North Korea.
Right. Now, we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions and ask for very, very short answers if you could. In 2010, I visited North Korea as a tourist, and I picked up a book that I saw there entitled The Human Rights Situation in South Korea, written by the DPRK Institute for the Research of Human Rights. Have you heard of this book or the institute that authored it?
No, sorry.
It was published in 1993, and I glanced through it, and it was a collection of many stories about bad things that happened or allegedly happened in South Korea. And what I found was most interesting was that the source documents cited in the book were almost all South Korean media. So, for example, Hangyeore, the left-wing magazine Mal, the magazine Dari, South Korean radio, even the Wolgan Joseon is cited as a source there. The rest of the quotes come from, quote, South Korean pamphlets, so it's hard to know the reality behind those. But it's interesting that the publishers of this book didn't think that it was a weakness to show that South Korean media is allowed to report on allegations of human rights violations that take place within South Korea. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
I think this is general with this type of regimes. I remember the same thing that happened in Poland. They do not realize that the way they try to criticize international community actually reveals their weaknesses. And I think this is, the propaganda regime functions as such that they think that this is actually contributing to propaganda of, let's say, how bad the situation outside is, but it might have opposite effect. And this had opposite effect also in former communist countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think, also the coverage later on in North Korea of, for example, let's say how people demonstrated against at that time this was the meat, the import of
the
beef,
US beef 2008.
Right?
Yeah.
You remember this is all showing, and when you talk to North Koreans, if they have seen this kind of photo or a report in North Korea, they do say that what struck them was that, how these people are able to go out on the street and protest against the government, right? Especially those that had some, let's say, independent evaluation of what is happening. So I think that in general, this system do not understand how it may have adverse effect on the population.
Continuing about Central and Eastern Europe and former communist countries, I'm curious, how has transitional justice proceeded in former communist countries of Europe, and what can we learn from that for North Korea?
Many of these countries established very particular type of transitional justice system. Germany and Czech Republic embarked on that very early on, post-transition. Poland embarked on that 25 years after. The reason for that was that there was a roundtable agreement with the solidarity, and part of the agreement, as we understand it now, was giving tacit amnesty to those who at that time were, in power, the communist government. And so, however, the voices to finish the so-called revolution, the peaceful transition, were present in the society, and so the government, embarked on that much later on. There are similarities in all of these systems. So, for example, the scrutiny of the persons that were involved that are competing for the major national posts and their background, the so-called vetting system.
Yeah.
This was one of the major feature. In terms of criminal proceedings, if you look at most of the countries, except for Yugoslavia, when they killed their president, there were no criminal proceedings against the top level of the leadership at the time. However, there has been proceedings against the mid-level of, let's say, judges who were, for example, issuing death penalties on certain persons that were obviously political criminals, or guards who were shooting, right? So these people, sometimes were too old to serve sentences. Some of them do serve sentences. One thing that in this transitional justice is common across these countries is the memorialization, kind of giving a clear message of what it was wrong and what is right. Because if you build the society based on democratic values, the society has to understand that certain behavior is a crime according to international standards. It's unacceptable. And this is how the society learns also. And this is what enters, the education, the publication. This is very present in schools, and in other forms of memorialization, kind of giving back, let's say, names to the nameless victims, exhumations that are going, for example, in Poland and so on. This is all kind of, the process is continuing. Right now, we do have a program for South and North Korean students, and we've been carrying that program for the last couple of years, I think 5 years, that the students visit actually Poland, Germany, The Hague, and they learn about these processes.
And it seems to me that the longer North Korea continues in this way, the more difficult any process of transitional justice might be, since so many people at so many levels are in some way complicit with the system.
And so it's impossible to really put to justice everyone. This is not how it works. If you look across the examples around the world, these are usually symbolic trials, and people who were involved in egregious crimes stand usually as a symbol, to give justice to victims. That process is very long also, and many victims will pass away, especially the victims of abductions, for example, from Japan, from South Korea, especially those civilians that were 100,000, taken during the war, Korean prisoners, right? This probably, this will only be their families that will be fighting for some form of recognition of what has happened to them and memorialization of what has happened in the history between two Koreas.
Now, Joanna, you've been working with Citizens Alliance for almost 20 years now. How do you keep doing it? Do you have hope that significant visible progress will be made in your lifetime?
Without hope, you are unable to continue this type of work. This type of work is too difficult, also mentally and psychologically, talking to all of these victims, to kind of carry on for such a long time without having a hope that something will change one day. How it will change, again, it's not up to me. It's a decision of North Koreans, and especially of North Korean government, to really start improving the situation on the ground. But I do hope that my activities and activities of others, empowering the victims to also speak for themselves. Not that me, from Poland will be speaking for them, but actually North Koreans can speak for themselves of what has happened, and the greater, let's say, recognition in South Korean society of what has happened in North Korea. If that changes, I will be satisfied as an old person later on.
Does the pressure from the outside on areas of human rights inside North Korea, does it actually have an effect within North Korea?
There are certain anecdotes that it does. And we did interview some victims who said that they were suddenly, being deported several times. They recognized that, for example, some police officers or secret police officers were asking them to sign that the human rights were not violated. So that was interesting to us, but this is anecdotal evidence, I think. I think there are certain things that North Korea does on the ground quietly, and that might lead to improvement. At the same time, in recent years, as you know, the pro-engagement policies resulted in the greater control over society. All of the laws that have been implemented in North Korea are actually serving to punish people who have access to foreign information, for example, even much more strongly, right? And so I think that this is something that we also have to be careful.
Okay, well, that's where we have to finish it for today. Thank you very much, Joanna Hosaniak of the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, for talking to me on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Listeners, you can find the Citizens Alliance online at nkhr.or.kr and on Facebook by searching for Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, and on Twitter at NK Human Rights. Ladies and gentlemen, if you already have an NK News account, and if you're a think tank, business or academic institution, take a look at NK Pro. Our NK Pro platform offers unparalleled services specifically catering to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. Inquire about access by sending an email to membership@nknews.org today. Our thanks, as always, go to Brian Betts and Arias Dare for facilitating this podcast, and to our post-recording producer genius, Gabby Magnuson, who I believe is a student of yours, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, etc. Thank you very much, and listen again next time.